Jason Sample. You're known so well in the community, but more recently, you've been known to us, the Jamestown Tarp Skunks, as the voice of the Tarp Skunks together with Norm at WRFA. And did the whole concept of radio broadcasting, did that come early on in your life?
It sure did. I was known to have a big mouth in school, Greg, and my teachers would always kid me about how loud I was without ever really trying. And I enjoyed, one of the few students that enjoyed reading out loud when it came to assignments, reading a story in elementary school or even junior high school. I was always one of the first ones that, chomped at the bit to do reading out loud. So it just came naturally to me. I enjoyed doing it, and had a couple teachers, Jim Vincent, for example, former art teacher at Falconer, encouraged me and says, maybe you should try getting into broadcasting, Jason. You seem like you really have a knack for it, and you definitely have a voice for it. So, just how it is when you're growing up in your formative years, you have people that sort of steer you or prod you in a certain direction. And I think early on, I knew that I wanted to get into broadcasting and use my voice for the greater good of mankind.
Well, broadcasting is a performing art. Is that something that was in your family?
Not really. My father and my grandfather both have deep voices and very commanding voices. So, you stand at attention whenever they call your name, whether you did something wrong or not. So, I guess genetically speaking, it just comes naturally that way. But no one really did much in terms of acting or performance arts or anything like that. I might have been the first person in my immediate family to do like drama and acting. I did a lot of theater in high school and even in college. So obviously, again, my voice projects. So it came very naturally to get on stage and utilize that for acting or broadcasting when I started doing that as well.
Well, do your academic arc here. You were from where? You grew up where?
I grew up, born in Jamestown. I grew up on the end of Buffalo Street Extension, all the way out in the town of Poland. It's kind of confusing, but it's a Jamestown address, but it's in the town of Poland. That's the Falconer School District. And my parents moved out there when I was 2, so pretty much grew up out in the countryside from the time I was 2 until the time I graduated from high school at Falconer. And throughout the Falconer school system, after Falconer, I went to Jamestown Community College for 2 years. I met somebody, was dating a girl at the time, who went to West Virginia University. So after I completed my work at JCC, I was considering possibly going into the Air Force, believe it or not. But I decided instead to transfer down to West Virginia University and study journalism, broadcast journalism down there.
So West by God and smile when you say it, Virginia, right?
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I still like to go down to West Virginia and visit it. I have a lot of connections down there and a lot of friends still down in that area. So my time in Morgantown was good to me, a little too good at times, but I obviously graduated from West Virginia University, stayed in Morgantown for another year to weigh my options, or maybe just to get the college life behind me as much as possible. And then I moved back up here in the summer of 2001, and I got a job at James Broadcasting.
So as you're weighing your options, did you have a sense that there was really your options were Jamestown? I mean, you were coming home?
Yeah, I had an internship with KDK in Pittsburgh, doing some video work for them. I never was comfortable in front of a camera, believe it or not. I know this interview is in front of a camera, and I've gotten more used to it over time, but I've always enjoyed the radio portion of broadcasting, using your voice and kind of being the mysterious person that nobody really sees. And a little awkward in front of a camera sometimes as well. I've gotten over that, of course, but I just found in college when I was doing broadcast journalism and the television portion made me a little bit too uncomfortable at times, and I enjoyed writing stories and using my voice again, so I definitely wanted to get into broadcasting. Couldn't really find any opportunities in the immediate Morgantown or greater Pittsburgh area, and so I knew that WJTN was looking for a part-time news person, and that was a good time for me, with my lease running out in Morgantown, to come back up to Jamestown and try my hand at James Broadcasting, working with Terry Frank, Jim Roselli, Dennis Webster, the list goes on, but that was really when I got my professional start in broadcasting. I did work in college radio for about 3 years down in West Virginia.
Well, in college, just go back just to complete that part of it. In college radio, were you a disc jockey? Were you a news analyst? Were you a guy on the beat someplace?
We had a sports department. West Virginia University has a very accomplished and respected college radio station that's highly regarded nationally. And so the manager of the radio station was a fellow by the name of Alex Gavula, and he was an ESPN producer and for baseball. And Alex was also a graduate of WVU back in the 70s, but he was a general manager of the radio station and worked with students to learn how it was to work in a professional environment in a college setting. And so what I learned at West Virginia University was the ins and outs of, along with the classes I took at the college, specifically the college radio station, was how to do interviews with coaches or players. You know, we had Mark Bolger at the time as a quarterback, so I would interview him during the press day for the football game, or Don Nealon, the head coach, Gail Catlett, the basketball coach for the basketball team down there. So it really was a training ground in a professional environment without getting paid, obviously. But as a college student, you really couldn't ask for a better program. So I started out in sports, and then I got away from sports, and I did eventually start being a DJ and doing a lot of the playing some music and doing the banter back and forth in the morning show and in the afternoons with other fellow students of mine, student colleagues that worked at the radio station. So that was a really good opportunity to sort of at least get comfortable in front of the microphone and know what radio was all about.
So you're in Morgantown, West Virginia, but not only on your own radio station, but did you listen to radio elsewhere, kind of a national, where there's certain broadcasters, sportscasters that you listened to and said, I'd like to be like him?
Well, I mean, television, obviously. I always liked Keith Jackson, the way that he broadcast. So I enjoyed watching college football a lot. So I would always listen to Keith Jackson, obviously ABC Sports, everyone, iconic college football broadcaster. And then the regular NFL guys you would listen to as well. Baseball, not so much, believe it or not. I never really got into too many baseball commentators or play-by-play, other than Bob Uecker. Everyone knows who Bob Uecker is, but I never really wanted to be that comical, sort of more of a slow delivery, and then when something exciting happens, then explode into the way Keith Jackson was really whoa Nelly kind of a approach to doing it. So yeah, you know, they call that critical listening, and we did a lot of critical listening in college, and also and not only for sports broadcasting, but I can remember getting into NPR and really enjoying Garrison Keillor, the way that he was folksy and the way that he did his program, and Ira Glass from This American Life. I can remember listening to him in college and really enjoying the way that he did his long-form documentary-style radio programming. So, you know, I wasn't just geared towards sports, but I knew I wanted to get into broadcasting. I mean, sports was really the one thing I wanted to do. A funny story is we did college hockey. The West Virginia University had a club hockey team. And so me being from Buffalo area, Western New York, you tell people you're from Jamestown, they don't really know, so eventually you just say south of Buffalo. And eventually people just associate you with Buffalo, although I'm 80 miles south of Buffalo, right? But when I was in college, people would say, well, do you like hockey? I said, well, sure, I love the Buffalo Sabres. And our sports director at the radio station, the college station, said, we need a play-by-play guy for hockey. I said, oh, yeah, I'll try my hand. Rick Jeanneret, rest in peace, Rick Jeanneret. I would love to try my hand at hockey. I've heard Rick Jeanneret do it numerous times. Couldn't carry a period, a single period of a three-period hockey game. I knew that hockey wasn't for me. It's the most fast-paced, complicated sport to call on the radio, and I knew that was the one thing I thought I would be able to do, and after one period of calling a hockey game, I've never called a hockey game again, and I have no plan or intention of doing so. But that was kind of funny when my sports director for the college radio station had called the guys down at the hockey rink, put Sample on the sideline and let him be the intermission reporter between periods, but don't let him call the next period. And that was the end of my hockey broadcasting. One period and done.
Very, very, very difficult. So you're back, now you're in Jamestown, you're working for James Broadcasting, the Jim Rosellis, Dennis Webster you talked about, Terry Frank. Did they put you into sort of just writing at first?
Not really. Ray Marks was the news director when I joined. James Broadcasting had a really robust news department. There was a lot of folks working there just in news specifically. There was Terry Frank, Ray Marks, Brandon O'Riordan was a colleague, Chris Kea, who went on to work at Buffalo, WBFO, and there was a couple of other part-timers as well. So they had a pretty advanced local news coverage for a radio station in a small market like Jamestown. But Ray Marks enjoyed my voice. He said, you've got a great broadcasting voice. I'd like to get you behind the microphone. So he started me out doing some news anchoring. And obviously being a college student, you mispronounce a lot of names. Trying to say Sam Teresi for the first time was tough. Now it rolls off the tongue. And there was a lot of other times where I mispronounced things. But he was a really good mentor of being patient and seeing that you had potential and working with you. So right from the get-go, I was doing a news anchor position in the weekends, on Saturday mornings, and also on Sundays at times, because they had news every day at WJTN back in the early 2000s. And then also doing feature reports. The ice arena had just opened, and so we called it the coolest project in town, and we did weekly updates on where that project was going with the Jamestown Ice Arena, and I would package those together, and we would find sponsors to cover cover the cost of doing those, and that was part of my job too. One of my first assignments was the coolest project in town every week, reporting from the ice arena and talking with folks who were involved with getting the rink open. So that was one of my first projects I remember. Then of course, at the end of the summer, September 11th was really, a day that stays with anybody who remembers that day. And working in the news department on that day especially was, one of the still long-lasting memories I'll probably carry with me. It's just how hectic and how changing things were on that day.
Well, let's elaborate. Let's focus in on 9/11.
We had
It all started around, 9 o'clock.
just before 9 o'clock on a
Yeah,
Tuesday morning.
That's right.
And what's amazing is I was just moved back from college. I didn't have a car, but my dad's a mechanic and he's, mechanically inclined. So he had an old 1984 Firebird he let me drive around, a T-top, right? And so I was driving that, but I didn't have a radio in it. So I'm driving into work at 9 o'clock in the morning, and obviously I'm not listening to anything. And it's about a 15-minute drive from my folks' house up to James Broadcasting. So I wasn't listening to the radio or anything, but right when I walked in, nobody was in the lobby, nobody was in the studios, and everybody was in the newsroom watching the television. And they were all just standing around the TV watching it. And I can remember being curious about what people were looking at on the TV, and they said that there had been a plane crash that crashed into the World Trade Center. And then right as I rounded the corner to walk in the room, somebody said, "Oh no, not another one." And that's when everybody became really concerned and just mouths wide open, aghast at the whole situation. And then from there, it was just you just couldn't stop following the wire. The Associated Press gave you information on a national scope that would come off the digital wire, and every 20 seconds you'd have a news story about a plane that's crashed in Washington, D.C., or a plane that's reportedly gone down in Pennsylvania. And there was a fifth plane at one point that they had lost track of, and so you were wondering how many planes are up in the air that we don't know exactly what their outcome is going to be. And so that was really fast-paced and hectic. Obviously,
Tell me, how did it work? Because obviously, you are affiliated at WJTN with, was it ABC?
Yep, it was ABC News at the time.
You just simply hit the dial and say ABC is going to run it?
Yeah.
Or are you kind of on the air?
It was a little bit
on air?
Yeah, it was a little bit of both, where the ABC News live feed was sent almost immediately once they realized it was a terrorist attack. So probably at about maybe 10 or 15 minutes after 9 o'clock, if I remember, we switched over to the satellite feed of ABC News. But every 20 minutes or so, Dennis Webster or whomever would jump on the air and say, "Once again, you're listening to WJTN. We have breaking news of a terrorist attack in New York City and Washington, D.C., and we're carrying ABC News." So we'd break in intermittently, but obviously we're trying to get a handle on what's happening as well. So my job was to sit in front of that AP wire and relay to Terry Frank and Ray Marks and the other colleagues in the news department, the wire just reported this, or running it into even the FM station, which at the time was SC93, and giving them, rip and read information if they had to get up there and read. But it really was that day, for the most of the day, nothing but carrying the ABC feed, with once in a while breaking in with stories. And I think we did do a local news that day at noon to get folks up to date on exactly what was happening, and then trying to find the local angle, obviously.
Help me out. Rip and read. Did it come off a teletype at the time?
Yeah, rip and read is basically what it sounds like, where you would have a digital feed of text that would come through. You would, as the news person reading the wire as the information came out, you would identify the stories that you think are worth passing along to the on-air people, because I wasn't on air that day, and you would just simply print it up, rip it, and hand it to the news anchor or the on-air personality, and they would just read it They call that rip and read because you don't really have much time to edit, revise, or even read ahead of time. You say you should always read your copy ahead of time, but on a day like that, it really is a case of ripping and reading. That's an old news term. I use it as secondhand, just typical terminology that I use, but I forget that a lot of people aren't in broadcasting, so they don't really think about a term like that, rip and read.
I'm hearkening back to the newspaper days where you had literally a teletype.
Right.
And they would be reading it, and then rip.
Yeah.
And then hand it to a copy editor who would
A
then.
little more sophisticated, but the same principle.
Yeah, I'm a big CKLW radio fan. I mean, that's how they used to do the news. They'd have that news audio underneath,
Right.
that's going on, and they would have some crazy news story. We digress. So you're WJTN, and what's next for you?
Well, I did the news at WJTN probably for about 4 years. The station was sold to a regional ownership group called Media One. James Broadcast, Ty Goldman had passed away before I even moved back into Jamestown, and his son Michael wanted to obviously focus more on his profession, not much like his father wanting to own a radio station. So he found somebody that was out of Cleveland called Media One. The owner was Jim and Brescia. And, obviously radio wasn't what it used to be in the 70s and 60s and 80s, so they had to make some changes, but they wanted to keep myself and Terry Frank on board to cover news. So probably for about 3 or 4 years, it was just Terry Frank and I who did the news for WJTN. 2005, an opportunity came up at Media One where they needed a new sports director, and I had expressed to Terry that I really would want to get back into stepping away from covering news and do more sports or even radio DJ. And they had just acquired a rock station, 103.1 FM WQFX out of Russell, Pennsylvania. And I wanted to get back into the roots of, being a rock and roll DJ that I used to do in college, as well as covering sports. And Nick Keefe, who was the operations manager at the time, acknowledged that I wasn't not wanting to stay in the news long term, allowed me to transfer over. So I was a sports director at Media One for probably 3 years, from 2005 to 2008. Did high school football, high school baseball.
This is following
basketball.
the Pete Hubble days?
Yep, that was after Pete Hubble. But they had a guy named Bill Wozniak who was the sports director when I joined. Bill moved to Indiana, I believe, in 2003. And then Matt Krieg took over as a sports director. He was a sports reporter anyway, and so it was a natural assimilation for him to take over. And then he moved to Indiana. And so that's when the opening was there, and I said, I want to do sports. So they let me do sports for about 3 years. And I did that until 2008. And again, another round of cuts came, and I was on the block there. So I ended up finding another job, short term, for a newspaper outfit, a weekly newspaper called the Chautauqua Star, run by the Maidum family up in Dunkirk. Mm-hmm. And I was their editor for my news background, as well as my connections around Chautauqua County. By that time, I familiarized myself with not just Jamestown, but a lot of the movers and shakers and people in the community. So I did the Chautauqua Star as an editor for probably 2 or 3 years. And during that time, I volunteered at WRFA Radio, where it's a community radio station. I wanted to stay in radio, so I talked with Dennis Drew, their general manager, probably at the end of 2008. And I said, do you have any need for anyone to help you out? He goes, yeah, whatever you want to do. It's a community radio station. You bring me the idea, and we'll let you do it. So I just did a weekly radio show, music program, more progressive rock, late at night, and I also helped out with some public service announcements, managing the library behind the scenes and things like that.
What did you know about WRFA? And give just good segue perhaps to the history of it all.
I knew my familiarity with WRFA is that it had recently started. It went on the air in 2004, and I remember seeing the articles in the newspaper, and obviously when you're a commercial radio station, any other radio station is competition, whether they're nonprofit or not. That's not the right mentality to have. I've learned that now. But back then, we didn't really cover it too much or talk about it. We covered the Arts Council, which held the license for WRFA, and we talked about the things they were doing. But as far as the radio station goes, we didn't really give it too much coverage, but off from not working at Media One, I felt that it was important for Jamestown to have, and I saw the value in it because I can remember listening to, I think it's WYEP in Pittsburgh, which is an NPR-affiliated non-commercial radio station that plays primarily music. And I thought, wow, Jamestown's finally going to have a radio station that plays the music I like. I like classic rock, obviously, but I also like a lot of alternative college underground music. And I said, that really isn't a niche for that in commercial radio. So I was happy to see that Jamestown had a radio program not only that would allow people to play that kind of music, but allowed anybody. You didn't need a radio background to go there. If you had the desire to get into broadcasting, they would let you do that. But I also knew they did a lot of cultural programming, a lot of talk-style programming. Anything they could find that they could put on the airwaves, they would, as you know, with your association with the Jackson Center. They would run the Jackson Center lectures. So, yeah, you know, being an employee of a commercial radio station, I still would deviate away from my employer and listen to WRFA for some of the programming they had. So I was loosely familiar with what it was, and obviously I knew Dennis Drew was the general manager from 10,000 Maniacs, and I had respect for him, obviously, for what he did in the entertainment business. And I had respect for him coming back to Jamestown when things slowed down a bit for 10,000 Maniacs, and I could see that he and Steve Gustafson really were invested in the Jamestown community, which I admired. You know, oftentimes you get big and popular, you don't have to come back home if you don't want to, but they felt the desire to do so, so I respected that.
Talk to me a little bit about the aha moment to even create. I know that was before your time, but Dennis probably conveyed what it
Sure.
was that started that. And there is an overarching group called the Arts Council. And underneath that was that the Reg? Was the Reg underneath?
It was actually two separate organizations. They were two separate nonprofits, but they worked in concert with one another,
Okay.
from, as I understand it. You know, the Arts Council for Chautauqua County leased space from the Regiland A, but the Arts Council also owned property as well through LLCs, and that was a way to help generate revenue, if I'm not mistaken. So I can't remember how it worked specifically with the theater itself, but I know that when WRFA first went on the air, the Reg was renting space or utilizing space within the theater complex for its offices. So the Arts Council for Chautauqua County administered art programming, not only in schools, but for artists around the community. Philip Morris was a name that was synonymous with the Arts Council for Chautauqua County in the 80s and the 90s, and he was still there when I moved back into Jamestown in 2001, because I can remember learning that he was leaving Jamestown. I remember covering that story specifically. So I was familiar with the Arts Council, and as I understand it, the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, opened up the opportunity through a 1996 Broadcasting Act through Congress for low-power FM stations to be created. They had to be non-commercial. They couldn't have a large broadcast range, hence low power. But they allowed different communities or nonprofit organizations to apply for licenses. And the Arts Council saw that there was somewhat of an interest in establishing this through Dennis Drew. Dennis Drew and Steve Gustafson actually wanted to invest their money and start their own commercial radio station. And they realized that was too expensive. But they wanted to still operate a radio station, so they felt if they could take advantage of that Broadcasting Act, I believe it was from 1996, when the next round of low-power licenses applications opened up, they approached the Arts Council and said, we want to do this. Dennis said, I want to start WRFA, or at the time it wasn't WRFA, it was just, I want to start a low-power FM radio station. And so David Shine was the executive director at that point, and he was all for it. And they looked into it, they applied for the license, they got the license and did some good old-fashioned fundraising and acquired enough money for the transmitter, the tower, and even a small makeshift studio. And WRFA was born in 2004. It got its license at the start of 2004, and it went on the air by September 2004. So as of this interview, I should say, 19 years ago.
Now, was Steve Schulman part of that early days too?
Steve Schulman was a consultant.
Ah.
Yeah, Steve Schulman had left SE93 and WJTN James Broadcasting by the time I moved back into town in 2001. So I never worked with Steve on the Hill, as we called it, up on James Broadcasting, where Media One is now. But I knew Steve through covering the Jamestown School Board, because he was a school board member at the time. So I was familiar with who Steve Schulman was, and I knew that he used to work at Media One. But yes, he was a consultant to help understand the nuances of programming, because that was Steve's primary job when he was at James Broadcasting, was programming. So he assisted Dennis and probably provided, you might not have been able to find anybody else in town who could do what Steve Schulman did in terms of guiding WRFA to be as structured and as reliable when it comes to, hey, I know it's this day, I know it's this time, I know this program's going to be on, because Steve Schulman was one of the driving forces behind understanding the need for somewhat of a rigid schedule with that flexibility that you get in community radio, and knowing that not every program is going to come in every week on time. But yeah, Steve was a consultant who really helped with how to identify programming and get it on the air once it was time to launch the radio station.
Early mornings, he was sort of also an on-air personality.
Yes.
In the morning.
Yeah, and people still to this day, because Steve retired in 2019, so it's been about 4 years now. But people to this day still wish that Steve was back on the air, because he had a really interesting, unique personality and a dry sense of humor. So he found a lot of humor in stories that you wouldn't necessarily find humorous or even worth sharing. But there were these little small stories that had some kind of an oddity about them, and he would find a way to bring that oddity about and share it with listeners. So they eventually called their morning show, when Dennis and Steve would chat, usually about a half an hour every morning, Small Things Considered. And Steve would bring forward small things from around not just the U.S., but around the world.
Right.
I think it was like a hobby of his when he wasn't working, is to identify stories for the next day to talk about on Small Things Considered.
Well, here we are, 19 years into this. Tell me about a little bit of the growth pattern here.
Well, in 2004, from what I understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, he's in the room helping us out. Ed Thomasini helped with and Rick Podson, who was a radio consultant, helped with the technical side of things. But yeah, in 2004, the station goes on the air in September. You've got Steve Schulman, who's assisting with the programming. You've got the technical side taken care of through the radio equipment. Ed, I believe, helped with that, and Rick Podson helped with the transmitter to make sure that the broadcast was going out over the airs. But it really was, a small community radio station where, again, Dennis encouraged anybody in the community that wanted to share programming or develop their own programming to come forward and volunteer. So it really was volunteer-based. They did raise funding for the cost of Dennis's salary and Steve as a consultant through various grants that they wrote for programming. They also did educational programming, not just on the air, but in Jamestown Public School through Radio Works and through even Video Works, where they would go in and work with students, and Jamestown Public School would contract with WRFA or the Arts Council in order to provide staffing assistants, not teachers, but artists instructors to go in and work with students. So that's a program that really began as soon as the radio station got on the air, from what I understand, and it's continued to this day. I still teach at Jamestown Public Schools through that program from 19 years ago after Dennis retired. But yeah, they found different ways through funding support, through foundations, underwriting, doing a lot of pledge drives. Well, actually not pledge drives. Dennis always steered away from pledge drives, but doing fundraising and community support. And it was a small budget, but a budget that made the radio station work. And the Arts Council offered its support as well. So it really was a community radio in the classic sense that had a small staff of an administrator and nothing more than volunteers or folks who had a passion to provide programming, whether it be from here at the Jackson Center or even Jamestown Community College. I think Nelson Gariffi used to come in and do reports and things like that. So Dennis was really good about reaching out to the community and collaborating with other organizations to augment programming as well. And it really was a shoestring budget, but one that worked, obviously, through the first 4 or 5 years of its existence. That was the way they did it every year to put the budget together.
You always been 24 hours?
Yes. From what I understand, it's been on 24 hours. The great thing, one of the sad things about radio in the 21st century is automation, because it took away the need to have somebody overnight on even commercial FM stations. So we used to have a guy up at Media One that was just there from midnight until 8 o'clock to make sure that all the programming ran on time and to keep an eye on things. But automation is just the software you can plug into a computer, and you can program it to schedule what program's going to run at what time, and you can set it so that it never gets behind or too far ahead. And automation makes it possible. Essentially, you don't ever have to be on the radio. You can always run everything through automation if you wanted to. And some low-power FM stations do that around the country.
Where do you find your programming?
That's a good question. A lot of programming is provided through just different outlets around the country that want to syndicate their programs. So an example that could work in Jamestown, and it may have been done in the past, is say the Jackson Center or Roger Tory Peterson Institute or the National Comedy Center. These organizations that have national appeal or broad appeal, not just isolated to the community they work within. If they wanted to create a program, they could develop this program and then they could distribute it on their own or through a partner radio station to other radio stations that would be interested in carrying that. And that's just a process that works regardless of where you're at in the country, where you can acquire different programs that may be produced in Minnesota or programs produced down in Texas, but they provide it free of charge because they want to get the word out about what they're doing as a way to market or promote their own little, I guess, not-for-profit organization or agency in a way that also is entertaining or educational in the sense of low-power FM. You know, low-power FM is intended to be cultural and educational and serve a public purpose. So, you know, technically, what is educational, what isn't? That's a gray area. Playing an hour of Jimi Hendrix could be educational because I want to feature and educate people on the greatest guitarist that ever lived, right? So, I mean, really, there's ways you can get around it, but long story short, you can basically identify a program that you think would work in any market and send it out and say, hey, you know, through either a network or a group, and inform others in that group that I'm in this market, but I have this program and I think it would work for your station. And Steve Schulman was really good at finding them and acquiring them. There's also a group called the National Federation for Community Broadcasters, an annual membership of, I think, $2,000, but it's well worth the investment for a low-power FM station because they keep you up to speed on the rules and the laws, but they also help you network with other radio stations about programming. So you really do just have to keep on looking. These programs don't run in perpetuity. Oftentimes they will just go off the air and not even inform you sometimes. You know, hey, we forgot to tell you that we're no longer carrying this program anymore. So you got to keep an eye on things. I actually keep a folder at work that is just prospective programs. So, you know, I have a backlog of prospective shows that I could carry if there's ever a gap in our programming, and I'm sure that's what Steve did as well.
So you have a grid. I'm looking at a 24-hour grid, and you got to fill it. And some of these programs, do you get a catalog and saying, gee, I'd like to have agricultural here, I'd like to have science here, maybe some collector, ephemera, something like that. And then do you pick and choose?
Yeah, basically. I mean, you want to keep it somewhat organized. In the broadest sense, for WRFA, the organization is educational and cultural programming during the day and arts and entertainment in the evening. So we try to steer any type of music programming, whether it be from a volunteer or whether it be a show like Woodsong's Radio Hour. We would want to try to start that in the evening hours. And in the morning, you have Chautauqua lectures, for example, or lectures in the Jackson Center from a local point of view, or any nationally syndicated shows. We try to focus more on the talk and the informative type programming during the daytime. And then from there, if you want, you can get even more specific. For a while there, we wanted to do cooks and books. So for an hour every weekday from 10 until 11 o'clock, we either had a cooking show or a show about books. And if you tune in at that hour, so you want the listener to kind of know what to expect in any given time they tune in. Otherwise, they might get turned off by saying, wow, I was listening to this great program yesterday. They had a wonderful guest on, this great lecturer, and now, you know, they're playing nothing but polka today. Why on earth are they doing that? I wanted to hear another lecture. So you want to try to keep it somewhat consistent in that sense, where on a daily basis, you want to sort of follow a general grid of programming. But again, because it can fluctuate so much on the availability of programs, and sometimes they'll be taken off the air and production. It's not always the case, but that's kind of how you try to focus on your programming side of things.
Is that your job?
Currently now, yes. With Steve, it was primarily Steve's job. Obviously, when I joined WRFA, I started as the public affairs director, but Steve Schulman, that was his job, and when he retired, Dennis and I worked together on it. We have an individual who actually finds the programs and schedules it, but in terms of determining what we're going to broadcast on any given day, that's sort of the general manager or the consultant's job.
Is that a challenge?
It can be. It can be at times. Right now, it's not. All the programming that we do, probably a good 80 to 90% is reliable. It's been consistent. Maybe 3 or 4 times a year, a program will no longer be produced and we'll have to find a filler. But again, I go back to my prospective programs, and I'm always getting new people contacting us through email or even calling us and saying, would you like to carry this program? So it really takes care of itself, and it doesn't happen so frequently that it's a burden. If anything, I wish I had more hours in the day to do a lot more programming that's sent to us, because I value people who reach out to us and think they have a program that would be interesting to our listeners. I mean, that's the whole point of community radio and low power. I try to explain that to people, is we want to provide programming that you won't hear on corporate or commercial radio, and we want it to be eclectic. We want it to be something you wouldn't hear on any other radio station. So people will say, why don't you do what WNED in Buffalo does and have a talk show about the local news and have a call-in show, or you need to have a conservative commercial FM, AM radio is full of conservative talk show programming. I have nothing against political talk show programming, although we have to walk a fine line there, because a low-power FM station by design isn't supposed to be political. Okay. We can report on the news, and obviously the guests that we bring in can oftentimes be political. If you're an elected official who's a member of one party or the other, there's going to be politics involved. But as a representative of the radio station, I myself can advocate politically, and I can't have my volunteers advocate politically. And that's a hard line to walk sometimes, because people are passionate about their views and their opinions, and they want to express them. So we have had people approach us and say, I'd love to do a show talking about this or that. And I said, well, if you can do it in an educational capacity, go for it. But I said, don't do a call to action and tell people they need to do this or they need to do that. Do it as an approach that's educational. As a low-power radio, you're limited by your miles from the point of transmission. Is it 10, 15 miles? I forget what it is. Yeah, probably square miles. It could be 3 or 4 miles in any direction, so probably 16 to 20 miles at the most of a radius. Who's your audience? People ask me that all the time, and I like to say anybody in the community who has an interest in what the community is doing, because we're a community radio station and we do have local programming. It's not all syndicated. But Dennis would always tell, especially underwriters, we don't do advertising because we're a non-commercial, but we do have underwriters, and we do seek businesses to support us. We can't do a commercial for them. We can't say, hey, stop by the restaurant tonight for buy one, get one free single order wings. We can just say, support is brought by this restaurant, located at this place. Hours are here and here, and they specialize in this type of service or food in the restaurant's case. And that's all we can do, is just give the very general information of who our underwriters are. And it can't run in the middle of programming. It can only be at the start of each hour. So you're somewhat restricted in how you can support the businesses that support you. But when they do ask, well, why are you asking us to give you money? Who am I sending my message out to? I oftentimes will say, studies have shown that public radio and nonprofit radio is oftentimes listened to people with discretionary income, and they're college graduates, and they're people who have an interest in the affairs of the community. So you try to use this broad stroke and lofty language to really appeal that, the people that do listen to us are oftentimes people of maybe a higher education, college educated, professionals in the community. But we also have people, a lot of my friends are in local bands, and I have great respect for them, but I don't think a lot of them went to college, but it doesn't mean that I don't think they're uneducated, and they listen to WRFA for the programming because of the music we do or the arts and entertainment. So it really is a wide cross-section, but you're right, it's a tough pitch to nail down, and it's difficult to quantify or determine exactly what those demographics are. Totally unrelated, but it was a sidebar. Remember, I learned from Merrill Rosen, WJTN, how did they know who's listening? You have these ratings and right.
Nielsen ratings, stuff like that, but you really get the bear down. And what he did was he would contract with each of the car company, McFadden, Ford, Schultz Chevrolet, and they would have a chart. And they would tune the car, turn on the car, and of course the radio's on. And they would check what station was that on.
Interesting.
So they would learn from the car mechanics of like 4 or 5 what it was, and they'd capture those charts. And that was their unscientific way, but
that
brilliant.
Sounds like a Merrill Rosen idea, though, too.
And I loved the idea. It was brilliant.
Right.
It was just because that is so blue collar look. Because what you listen to a station, and you turn off the car, it's still on.
It would make sense, yeah. You know, primarily for the longest time with satellite radio, they've gotten away from it, but for the longest time, the majority of people that listen to the radio typically was while they were driving.
Yeah,
So,
of course,
yeah.
yeah. Exactly. So, talk to me about, well, you now become the station manager. Dennis
Right.
retired in 99?
2021 was his official retirement. So, yeah, just to back it up, so WRFA was doing its thing for about 4 or 5 years, and it finally was making enough money through grants and funding and support where it qualified for Corporation for Public Broadcasting Support, CPB. And that's a very integral part of what the station is today, is the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, because that allowed Dennis to bring on staff, whereas before, as I noted, it was basically the administrator and Steve the consultant. But with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, not only did it allow him to hire a public affairs person, news person, but it also allowed the station to purchase syndicated programming of a higher quality. I guess it would be a good way to say that. So you would be able to provide programming that was really engaging for people, and oftentimes you can only do that through these different syndicated I guess it would be subscription services is a good way to look at it, where they would give you a platform or programs, but you would have to subscribe to them on an annual basis. And you could use your CPV money for the subscription costs, and then you could tap into the different shows or programs that they made available. So a lot of the cultural programming that we do, a lot of the lectures that we do, a lot of even the food, cooks and books that we do, those were all purchased through a subscription-based area. But on the other side of that, so not only are you now providing better syndicated programming, of a higher quality and a higher production value, but now you have the ability to provide more local content through your public affairs director. Dennis, obviously, as the GM, you're focused on operations, management, underwriting, fundraising. It's a lot of hats to wear, I've realized, as a general manager, let alone the programming that you're providing. So he was able to hire a public affairs person, and that was Case Kinney back in 2010, because WRFA acquired its first CPB grant funding through the Community Service Grant of CPB in 2009. So they brought in a young college graduate by the name of Case Kinney, who was their public affairs director for about a year and a half. And so he went out and covered the news, brought in the mayor, brought in people from the community, did a lot of interviews, and provided that extra amount of local coverage that really has snowballed into making WRFA, I think, a valuable public service to the community by being another outlet that provides in-depth look at news and information from the community, and also these interviews that can run half an hour to an hour at a time. So yeah, the CPB is a huge player in the evolution of WRFA, and that occurred in 2009. And I came on board in 2011. Case Kinney got a better job, and he moved out of town. And Dennis, I was a volunteer, said, "Do you want to do news for WRFA?" And I said, well, yeah, I was kind of getting away from the editorial part of Chautauqua Star. I was still a consultant with them, but I just wasn't, my heart wasn't in print media. Like I said, since I was young, my passion was broadcasting. So I said, yeah, I can get back into doing news. So I started in 2011, and I continued on throughout much of the decade as the public affairs director for WRFA. And then the pandemic occurred in 2020. I was an essential employee, so I continued working throughout the pandemic, never took a week off, continued showing up, covering the online health department news conferences from both the state and local level. It still kept up with public affairs through the city, whatever the community was doing to deal with the pandemic. So I continually worked throughout 2020. By that time, Dennis was getting refocused and winding down, and he felt it was a good opportunity to step away as the general manager. And so in the start of 2021, he announced that he'd be retiring, and that's when just myself being there for 10 years and Steve Schumann having already retired, I guess I was the natural fit for the next in line to be the station manager. So I took over in March 2021.
So 2021, talk to me about the funding, the economics of it all. You're a not-for-profit being through the Arts Council, which is a
Right.
501c3, so hence you've got the benefit of the 501c3 status, but you still got to raise the money.
Well, yes, and to throw another wrench into the whole equation, you've got to remember that the Arts Council existed separately from the Reg Lene Civic Center until 2013. But the two organizations merged. The Arts Council doesn't exist anymore, and a lot of people, here we are 10 years later, a lot of people still assume the Arts Council is in existence, but it's now the Reg Linnaeus Center for the Arts.
Thank you.
Reg Linnaeus Civic Center, Arts Council for Chautauqua County became the Reg Linnaeus Center for the Arts, and it's a singular entity, a singular organization, one board of directors, one mission statement, one organization in the community that holds the license for WRFA. So the license transferred over to this merged, newly created organization in 2013. So WRFA has been a program of the Reg Linnaeus Center for the Arts for the past 10 years.
Okay.
Funding hasn't been an issue because of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. They require you to raise a certain amount of money, and you can do that as long as it's not federal funding, and you can show on paper that you've raised X amount of dollars. For the first 6 years of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting qualification for WRFA, it had to be $100,000. That's relatively easy enough to do if you're a small radio station because you do enough fundraising, enough contracting, enough grants to show on paper you've raised close to that amount. And then you have what you call indirect administrative support. So you could say, well, a portion of the office manager for the Reg Linnaeus, or at the time the Arts Council, can go toward working with the radio station. So the CPB looks at the formula and says, oh, here's a radio station that made over $100,000. Whether or not the radio station actually raised that much for its own program, another story, but that indirect administrative support really helps boost that number up. Well, that continued on until about 2015 or 16, and then the CPB got together and said, we need to change our formula, and the threshold is now going to be $250,000. And many people suspect that was by design to get low power and smaller public non-commercial radio stations out of the hair of the CPB and to focus more on the more structured, rigid NPR style stations. And I love NPR, so I'm not bad-mouthing NPR by any means, but that was really the nature behind it, is let's direct the Corporation for Public Broadcasting money, which is the steward of federal money. CPB is not a federal agency. It's a nonprofit corporation of its own, but it works with the federal government to get the money, and then it distributes the money. And the CPB felt we need to have a better focus on how we distribute our money. So it's going to be $250,000. Well, even with indirect administrative support, WRFA only makes so much money. And in a community that is rural, low population, and relatively a high poverty rate, it's difficult to raise that kind of money. Fortunately for the Reg Linnaeus Center for the Arts and for WRFA, as they went through a capital project in 2016, 17, and 18, and local foundations along with New York State put a lot of money toward this capital project. And a portion of that project went to WRFA. So this was a multi-million-dollar project. You got to figure if even 30% of that multi-million-dollar project involved WRFA, well, on paper, we're showing the CPB, we're still raising $250,000 a year for 2016, 17, and 18. So we were still doing good. 2019, the good days were over in terms of, on paper, showing that we were raising that threshold. CPB recognizes this, and they don't want to pull the rug out from radio stations that are qualifying for their money. They explained to us that you have 4 years to raise $250,000. So even though you didn't raise $250,000 this year on paper, as long as within the next 4 years you can do that, we'll extend your qualification for the CPB for another year. So in 2019, we knew that we probably would lose our CPB funding by the year 2023, unless we raised $250,000. So let's do it. Well, the pandemic happened, and obviously everything gets put on hold. You're not raising any local money during the pandemic, and a lot of our funding came through the CPB. So much so, they gave us even more money because there was the CARES Act federally that allocated a certain amount of money to the CPB, and the CPB, instead of trying to have people apply for the money, looked at who their recipients were and just gave them extra money. American Rescue Plan a year later resulted in another large sum of money for WRFA. Twice as much money as we get in any given year from the CPB, we received through American Rescue Plan grant funding. So not only were we receiving community service grant money, WRFA was fortunate to benefit from the CARES Act as well as the American Rescue Plan in 2020 and 21. I'm still spending down the budget for my ARPA money. That's how much money we received because we didn't want to create so much programming that it would become unmanageable, and also to hire so many people to spend that money down in the course of a year where you lay them off a year later. There's only so much contracting you can do. I hired a few part-timers, did some great programming with the Tarp Skunks, but there's a variety of programming that we've developed over the past 2 or 3 years through that ARPA money that wouldn't have existed otherwise. But the challenge now is that we've got so much programming we're doing that's supported by the CPB that there really is no opportunity or need to do local fundraising. And the funders recognize that. So that's, they're going to say, well, you seem to be doing great, WRFA. We don't want to necessarily continue funding you. Another challenge is the Reg Linnaeus Center for the Arts is a 100-year-old theater with a lot of needs. And rightfully or wrongfully, the board of directors, the governing board for WRFA, mind you, is also the board of directors for the theater. Their priority is obviously taking care of a local landmark, the 100-year-old theater. And with CPB taking care of WRFA, they never really felt the need to focus attention on, let's write a grant from a local foundation to continue supporting WRFA. Why would we want to? The radio station is doing great with its CPB money. So we've really survived primarily through CPB, except for my position. CPB doesn't allow you to use any of its programming funding for administrative work. So they would not allow CPB money to cover the cost of the general manager. So I still have to do local fundraising, but through my contract with Jamestown Public Schools and through my basic underwriting that we do, we've been fortunate to cover the cost of the general manager and then some. And that has allowed the radio station to continue on and provide funding for the parent organization. Because any I guess they would call it temporary restricted money I raise in a given year, at the end of the year, if my budget is covered and there's a surplus, well, that goes back into the general operating fund for WRFA. So Reg Linnaeus Center for the Arts has benefited greatly from WRFA the past 3 years due to the fundraising we've done locally that has more than covered the administrative side of the WRFA budget, along with the CPB covering everything we do programming for the past 3 years because of all that additional money we received from them. It's really a feast or famine situation, Greg, because right now we're feasting well, but the famine is just around the corner as well.
And you've been given some form of notification, or they're actually, those grants, they've ended because of the pandemic has ended?
Right.
The extraordinary grant process, so what, you've gotten, the game has changed.
Yeah, it's less than a year ago, at the end of 2022, I was under the impression that I had quite a significant, I guess you would call it, a amount of money a reserve fund is a good way to call it. I had a reserve fund that would carry me into 2024. So I had my CPB money for the remainder of this year, a good portion of this year anyway. They go by a fiscal year. So we're a CPB qualified station until September 30th, 2023. So I knew that I could continue using the money until then. That ARPA money the same way. We've been spending that down this year, so I know that that's pretty much going to be spent. $187,000, it's no secret, it's public money. That's how much of the ARPA money we received for the radio station that I've been spending down. So we had that to fall back on for programming for this year. And I did have the CARES Act money that didn't have that restriction of needing to be spent before you're disqualified as a CPB station. So that was going to be my reserve for 2024. But due to some accounting oversight, I've learned recently that the CARES Act funding, my funding that I was going to use in reserve for next year, was no longer available. Unfortunately, it was utilized to cover some expenses in 2020 when the theater was dark and shut. So that funding sort of was no longer available. I was informed of that in the summer of 2023, and that's when I was in one of those modes of like, oh dear, what do we do now for 2024? And so I met with the.
Is that exactly what you said?
Well, for the sake of this interview, that's what I said, Greg. It may have been a little bit more colorful, but. It was more of some salty language being tossed around. Yes, but it is what it is, and you roll with the punches. And so I sat down with the executive committee for the board, and they expressed that the theater itself also has its own priorities and challenges to look at. So it really was, we value WRFA, but we need WRFA to be sustainable on its own. So come up with a plan to sustain WRFA in 2024. And I said, okay, well, I'll give you my budget in November of 2023 like I do every year, and by then I hope to do some working with the community and explained to them, and they said, well, we would really like to see a plan in place by September 1st. So it's kind of an all-hands-on-deck approach for me anyway for the month of August and even into September of creating a strategic plan for the radio station that will show that the station can continue moving forward beyond 2023. And it can. I mean, I put them to rest. So there's low-power FM stations around the country that have shoestring budgets. They wish they lived in a community like Jamestown that had these opportunities where the support is there. But some of these radio stations out of Vermont and a station out of North Carolina I talked to have budgets of $25,000 or $35,000. That doesn't necessarily seem like a lot of money because it really is volunteer-based strictly, and you just have an administrator, whether it be part-time, working with volunteers and doing the fundraising. So at the very austere level, WRFA can continue in 2024, and if nothing else, we just need to work on more collaborations with community partners and get the word out. And that's what I'm trying to do now, is get the word out about the challenges facing the radio station and hoping that folks step up to the plate and give us a hand. So that's kind of where we're at.
This will air probably before Tuesday, and that you have your first, at least that I'm aware of, community outreach seeking that input where the community can react to you and your advisory board and board as well. Where will it be, and what do you hope to accomplish there?
Well, it's going to serve two purposes. I used to be on the Historical Society for Chautauqua County. I'm still a member of the Chautauqua County Historical Society. I've given a few lectures in my day, so it's going to be a presentation, but also an input session where the first part is going to be sort of the history that we just discussed. So it'll be the history of the radio station, all the different major events and milestones that have occurred over the years, and then also painting the picture of the current challenges we face, how we got here. But the second half is really going to rely on the community, the stakeholders that are going to be in attendance, whether they be underwriters, just people who have donated, listeners. You don't have to be a donor or an underwriter to attend this meeting. It's anybody who's in the community that's interested in WRFA and interested in what a community radio station can do in the future. So give them the details of what the station is facing, and then get input from them on what they would like to see the station do, knowing that we don't have a CPB funding on a regular basis, like the community service grant that will sustain us, let alone the ARPA funding. So a lot of, hey, what programming do you like that we've done that we can maybe possibly try to identify grants or funding to continue doing that, whether it be a community conversation, whether it be Arts on Fire Live, these live performances we do, whether it be the news that we continue providing, whether it be community baseball in Jamestown.
Ooh, good show.
Right. Anything like that. We just want to hear from people and also how they can help out, whether they want to help out with fundraising, whether they want to be a volunteer, or whether they just want to advocate on behalf of WRFA. So it really is twofold. One, to inform and paint the picture of what we're doing and where we're at. And then the second half is for us, the radio station, my advisory board, not the governing board. WRFA is required by law to have a community advisory board, and we have several solid. Dennis Drew is a member of the community advisory board in spite of retiring. So we want the advisory board and the staff and management of the Regillane to hear from the community. Hopefully, the management and the board of directors at the Regillane will be there so they can understand the value attached, so they know that it's a worthwhile program to continue. I think their biggest concern is how do you continue being a valuable asset to the community, knowing that a large portion, about 60% of your budget, is going to be going by the wayside through CPB. And as I noted a moment ago, that can be accomplished a number of ways, regardless of the budget, on a very small budget as well. But for the past 2 years, you look at the profit and loss of the radio station, you see the amount of funding that's been brought in surplus that has assisted with non-WRFA direct programming with the indirect administration, but also the fact that you see, wow, here's a budget that was close to $230,000 in 1 year because of that ARPA programming we were spending down. But on paper, that's a once-in-a-lifetime thing that you're going to have, and I try to relay that to them, that there was times in the past when we had an $80,000 budget or even a $75,000 budget. The nonprofit organizations know this, and oftentimes the board of directors aren't as entrenched in the nonprofit world, so they're not familiar that your programming is dictated by the money you raise, but it doesn't mean that the program itself needs to go away. It just means that you expand or contract depending on where your funding's at. And that's the message that I want to convey to the community as well, is that WRFA is not going anywhere, at least for the next 7 years, because our license isn't up for renewal again until the year 2030. So the radio station can exist regardless of how much CPB money we get or how much funding we don't get. I think it's really just getting that message across and rallying the troops to maximize the potential of WRFA, knowing that there's going to be certain restrictions in the next few years that currently aren't in place.
This has been great, Jason, and though we don't have a time constraint, is there a question you thought I should be asking you that here we are that I haven't asked you?
No, just the why is community radio important in a place like Jamestown or in any community around the country is because I worked in commercial radio and I have great respect. I still broadcast the Babe Ruth World Series this past week for Media One Group. I have a great collaboration with Terry Frank, Andrew Hill, who's now the operations manager there. I have a lot of respect for Dennis Webster and a lot of the old guard as well as the new folks that work up there. But commercial radio is, you know, in and of itself by design intended to be commercial radio. So it's oftentimes is dictated by those that advertise or the corporate overlords. I mean, it's not locally owned and operated. It's operated locally, but it's not owned locally. And oftentimes the corporate interests might not allow you to have as robust programming as you may want to at the local level. But community radio allows you to do that. If there's a desire in the community or a need in the community for somebody to say, we need to talk about this, or we need to educate this, or we need to have an hour-long polka hour. I don't care if advertisers don't want to do a polka hour. I want to put together the polka hour and educate people on Marion Lush and all the great polka artists in the world throughout the history of polka. Well, then you can do that. And I mean, that's a really general example, but I mean, that's kind of what a community radio station is there for, is to provide programming of an entertaining, educational, or cultural nature that isn't dictated by the whims of advertising or ownership. And so that's kind of the important role WRFA plays, but also the important role that any low-power, non-commercial FM station plays, no matter where you're at in this great country of ours, Greg.
Well, we're great to have you, and what I see in your eyes and I see in your voice is a passion. And with that passion, the success will continue. So thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate it.
Appreciate it. Thank you.